I've seen stories that Jenny Jerome, the mother of Churchill, was Jewish, and this has been reported in a Jerusalem newspaper, I think, a few months ago. And now I'm obviously looking into that she had Jewish blood in her maternal line. Very interesting indeed. I don't think Churchill was cognizant of that fact. He never mentioned it. But what is interesting are his links with the Jewish community, which I'll go into in a little bit of detail here, because they've not been gone into by any of the other Churchill biographers, for obvious reason. In particular, the main authorized Churchill biographer, Martin Gilbert, hasn't gone into it for the simple reason that he's one himself, and he doesn't want to harp on that fact. But the two basic areas of interest to look at in Churchill's career are the period when he was in the so-called wilderness, when he resigned from Stanley Baldwin's cabinet as a minister, and for the next 10 years, until 1939, he was out of office, out of any office at all. He was just a member of Parliament. So all he had was his salary as a member of Parliament and his rather pitiful earnings as a journalist, and yet somehow he managed to support an enormous country estate, which cost a very large sum of money to support, with all the gardeners and the nurseries and the nurses and the nannies and the cooks and the housekeepers and all the rest of it. He had a private staff of sometimes 20 or 30 people, all supported on his salary as a member of Parliament, which was at that time £500 per annum, $750 a year, or $2,000 actually, because at that time I think it was $4 to the pound. How did he do it? Well, the answer is that from 1936 onwards, he was financed by a little secret pressure group called The Focus. You won't find much reference to The Focus in the history books, but it certainly existed, and there are several files of Churchill's private papers relating to The Focus. The Focus was a group of perhaps 30 or 40 leading British industrialists and bankers and former politicians who decided that Churchill was worth keeping afloat, and they funded him. They weren't all Jews. They were primarily Jewish, but there were also left-wing socialists and left-wing conservative members of Parliament who all decided to keep him afloat. In July 1936, the then chairman of the British, of the Shell Petroleum Company, wrote out a cheque for Churchill of the order of £40,000, which in modern day money would be probably about $700,000, and gave it to him as a gift. He was Jewish. It was a Jewish gift to Churchill, and the intention was that Churchill, they bought him. He became the Pied Piper from that moment on, and the one who pays the piper calls the tune. If you look at the events as they really happened, until 1936, he hardly gave Germany a passing mention in his speeches and writings. Other things were more important. From 1936 onwards, he began beating the anti-Nazi, anti-German drum. And at that time, there was a great deal of pro-German sentiment in Britain, as witnessed the behavior of the Duke of Windsor, the King. King Edward VIII, who ruled for just less than a year after the death of his father, was very pro-German and pro-Hitler, and actually got on very well with Adolf Hitler when he visited Germany later in 1937. He was forced to abdicate by the same lobby, but it was this lobby which was financing Churchill from 1936 onwards, and which finally maneuvered and engineered his introduction into the cabinet in 1939, and finally his taking over as Prime Minister in 1940. He fought a war that Britain had no real interest in. And I've repeatedly said this. Any logical perception of World War II now, looking back after 50 years, screams to the high heavens. And we can see quite clearly that we should have said to the Poles in 1939, you've got a problem with the Germans, sort it out yourself. We should have said to the Jews, you've got a problem with the Nazis, sort it out yourself. It's no concern of Britain and the British Empire. We've got other fish to fry. That's what we should have said. Churchill, unfortunately, was beholden to these people, and he had no alternative. So in 1940, when we had a choice put to us of accepting the very generous peace offer that was put to us, which has been concealed from the history books by the Germans, or of fighting a totally senseless war onwards, Churchill took the wrong turning and bankrupted Britain and ruined the British Empire. I first said this in my book, Churchill's War in 1987, and now 5 other major historians have said the same thing. This has now become known as the revisionist line of history of the Second World War, and I'm the one who actually opened up that path, making people think the unthinkable, looking at the alternative route that we could have taken in 1940. In 1941, just to end this, it becomes very interesting indeed, because the Weizmann papers, which are the papers of Chaim Weizmann, who was the first president of the State of Israel, and he was the leader of the international Zionist movement throughout World War II. The Weizmann archives, foolishly or wisely, gave me complete access to all the Weizmann correspondence with Churchill. And in the Weizmann archives, all Churchill's correspondence with Weizmann throughout the war years and before the war, and all his notes on his meetings with Churchill. And I'm only going to mention one of those letters here. It's a letter written by Chaim Weizmann, the leader of the Zionist movement, at that time living in the United States, to Winston Churchill in September 1941, 3 months before Pearl Harbor, when Churchill is frantically trying to claw the United States into his war, because that's his only salvation. And Weizmann writes to Churchill a letter which he says, Mr. Prime Minister, unless you grant us what we want, which is the creation of a Jewish army in the Middle East, with our own arsenal and our own weapons and our own uniform and our own flag, unless you grant us what we want, then you are not going to win us over. And let me tell you what we will do if you do grant us what we want. If you grant us our wishes, then we will act on your behalf in the United States. And remember, Mr. Churchill, he writes in this letter, remember, we are the only powerful, unified bloc in the United States which solidly backs the British cause in this war. September 1941. Everybody else is basically isolationist. We are the only ethnic, unified group which solidly backs the British cause. We are the only people who are in the position to bring the United States into this war. We did it in the last war, and we can do it again. Needless to say, I quote this letter in volume 2 of my Churchill biography in a chapter called We Did It Before and We Can Do It Again. And I don't expect to get any applause from the newspaper community in Britain for having revealed this letter, but I think it's a very telling document.